Okay, well today what we're looking at is the parish of Tain, which is in Rossshire, and we're looking at life there in the 1790s. The research has been done, as you know, by my cousin Joel Smith from BC, and he's prepared the paper, and we've already done 2 of these meetings. So welcome to Tain Parish and Royal Burgh. It's a royal borough. So did you see? So our objective then is to look at the location of Tain, its history, look at the structure of everyday life in Tain, things that could be done there that might not be possible elsewhere, the sort of people they had and the work that they might have had or sources of income they might find. We'll look at some of the McLennans who lived there, and we'll look at some curiosities, which is going to be interesting. So here's the guy who wrote this account, the old statistical account. In fact, he's called Reverend George Douglas. You can see there, this is a picture of the first page of the statistical account for Tain Parish, parish of Tain. And he wrote it quite early on. 1783 is quite early for the statistical accounts. Usually they're in the early to mid, even late 90s. But he's, in fact, by the late 90s, 1790s, he was deceased, this minister. So just as well he got it in when he did. If you could turn off your microphones, that'd be great. Thank you. So 1793, and you can see there, look, it says here, situation and see. The parish of Tain is situated, there's that word with the F instead of the S, situated in the county of Ross, county and synod of Ross. It extends from you know, it started to talk about the location. So let's have a look more closely at where it is in relation to the other parts of the country. So I've got my laser pointer on now. So here are the main places. You can see Inverness down here, and this of course is Inverness-shire down the bottom. This is the Black Isle in here. Someone's got a mic on.
Yes, it's fine. Okay.
Can you turn off your microphones, please? Someone, I can't see who. Oh, Marilyn, maybe Marilyn. Can you turn your mic off, please? That'd be great. Okay, so coming back to the map, can you see the pointer there? Yes. So this is the Black Isle in here. The capitals of each county, and here's Sutherlandshire County up here. The capital of that is Dornoch. That's there with that little dot, that separate dot. The capital of Cromarty Shire, which is a separate county to Rossshire in these days. And the capital of Inverness Shire is here with a little dot. And so you can see up here that Tain has a dot like the other capitals. Tain is the capital of Rossshire. So this is an important place we're looking at in this session here today. You can see the mountainous districts in here with these lighter coloured parts of their parishes. But in Tain, you don't see much of that light thing. This is all reasonably level out here. In Tain, you can see the Dornoch Firth in here coming in, and these little promontories sticking out into it. You can see this headland. So Cromarty is down here. You can see that. The parish itself is not very large by comparison with, say, Olness that we dealt with earlier, or some of these other ones that we're looking at later, Conton. But it is the capital of Rossshire. This document, by the way, is available for you to access, not with these lightening and darkenings on it, but the original of it is available in the Clan documents. So if you just go into the front page, look for documents, and then click map and search for map, you'll see there aren't that many, you know, probably half a dozen that have got the word map in their title, and you'll find this map there if ever you want to see where. I do it more often than you would expect. This is a contemporary picture from today of Tain, but it gives you a feel for the nature of the countryside. You can see it's reasonably flat all around it. This, of course, is the A9 road that's now bypassing the town. This straight line through here is the railway, which of course didn't exist in the 1790s. But the Firth here, the Firth of Dornoch, is the important feature. And this bridge in here is a replacement for a former ferry that used to be across there called the Mickle Ferry, spelt various ways, but that's the more conventional way today. And I've put in, just since all our last session, especially for you, Rory, where the golf course is. Because over on the other side, of course, you have the Royal and Ancient Dornoch. In fact, I have some balls from there that I've given to my golfing pals, Rory, you'll be pleased to hear. And the last time I was there, it was really dry because this is all on quite sandy soil. And, you know, it expects regular rain, otherwise it's not very good, very green. That's what I saw when I was at the Dornoch golf course. I didn't play there, Rory, though. I just went and bought the golf balls. But it's important here to look at the Tain golf course because that's going to come up as a reference point for us when we're talking about some parts of the town. And the clubhouse is just up here at the end. So you can see how incredibly close the clubhouse is to the centre of Tain town. This is an older map, the one that comes in the online version of the statistical account, because it's from that sort of period, from a long time ago. And you can see Tain in here. You can see now the ferry across here. Here it's called Muckle Ferry. And the bridge actually runs across there now, but just a little bit further in is the former ferry. And you can see there are not many mountains marked in here, but there are these forests and hills further back. You can see there's a place in here called Morangi, or however you like to say it. And the other parts that are quite interesting here are these red parts that are actually part of Cromarty Shire. So you know that Cromarty is not here. This doesn't mean point of Cromarty, it means part of PT, part of Cromarty County. So that's how Cromarty County was. It was all these little pockets all around Ross-shire that, and it wasn't all in the one place, the county. And so these are parts of the Cromarty County that are in, you know, the middle of Tain and other parishes, east of Ross. So that's called Logie East of this parish down here, and that's a part, Tain, that's a part of it. I'm going to also point out to you this place here, Cadbol, or I think it even says, no, Cadbol, I think it is, not ball, not bull, but Cadbol is how it's known. And there's a place here, Hilton. They're places that you're going to need to know. That'll be on the exam. It's a joke. Yeah, so this is where Tain is in here. Okay. Let's talk about the number of people who were there and so on. 2,100 in the most recent parish before he wrote this account. That's 8 years earlier. It's quite a large number for a parish. You know, it's supporting quite a lot of people. And for a small parish, that's quite interesting. You think, well, how could that be? Why are there more here than there are in some other parishes, don't you? That's a logical thing to think. He says the average numbers of births, marriages and burials for the few years before he wrote this account were 70 births, quite a lot, and 15 marriages, you know, at least that's what he knows about. These are not, you know, a bit rubbery, these figures, of course, and 35 burials. Of course, there were no death records kept in those days, not really. He says quite an interesting thing about migration. No mention of sheep, by the way, in this account, which is interesting. Maybe it's just that little bit earlier. Maybe there never were any sheep. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you know, he says, and I'm quoting here from the statistical account itself. He says, firstly, he says, there have been no emigrations from the parish. So that's the interesting thing. Okay, no immigrations. That's really quite amazing, not possible. So then immediately after that, he says, but several young people go yearly to London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, or Aberdeen, comma, the West Indies, comma, and North America. That's interesting. How could he say there are no immigrations and then say all this, that people are going to other cities in Scotland and also to the West Indies and to North America? It can't, it's irreconcilable. Well, I think the only way I can think that it's reconcilable is that he's not talking so much. He says several young people go yearly. So I guess he's thinking that these aren't like families. They might be people just going to work for a while and possibly come back. You know what I mean? Like they're not people who permanently left saying, I'm going forever to the West Indies or whatever. So maybe that's how it's reconcilable, these two statements that he makes here. And then he says, which sort of adds to that theory, he says after, you know, Aberdeen, West Indies and North America, he says, some of whom, this is, and North America, some of whom have prospered well and have been of service to their relations. What do you think that means? I suspect it means they're sending money home from, you know, their riches that they've made in these parts, whether it be within Scotland or West Indies or in North America. That's the only way I can reconcile it. And then he goes on to say, a good many go into the army, comma, chiefly to regiments who wear the Highland dress. Hardly any go to the Navy. So this is why you have this picture here of someone in rather Highland looking dress in the army, because apparently some do that. So yeah, we probably can assume though that there aren't a lot do this from this parish. You'll see as we go along that it's really becoming a slightly more modern place than we saw in Loch Carron last week. Okay. So now I'll hand over to Joel, who's going to talk about this next slide.
Yeah, the Gizen Briggs. I think, Bruce, it's written with without the R. It's just Gizen in all my research.
All right.
In any case, yeah, the Gizen Briggs. So what they are is sandbanks that extend along both the north and south shore of the Firth, all the way up the Firth, and yeah, they're quite an important feature of the parish. Yeah, and when the tide is out, the entrance of the Firth is actually reduced to a rather small opening. Some of the older folk had said that it was so small that you could throw a board across the entrance and walk across, which was probably a bit of an exaggeration. But nonetheless, the name Gizen Briggs is supposed to be of Norse origin, meaning leaky bridge, and the local legend has a story. And in Gaelic, the name of these banks are Drochich an Uv, which means water kelpies bridge. And the legend is that these water kelpies were trying to build a bridge across the entrance of the Firth made of ropes of sand. However, then the tide came in and washed all the sand up the Firth, and that's why you have these sandbanks on both sides. Yeah, and of course these sandbanks make it rather difficult for ships to land in Tain. Even for experienced sailors, it's rather difficult to navigate, and you would need to know the tide schedules quite well. Some smaller ships can land at Inver, which you can see on the eastern part of the parish there. But the bigger ships will have been landing in Cromarty to the south, and then the merchants would have to carry their goods overland, which, well, that might be a bit annoying, but that's what they had to do.
Mm-hmm. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So yeah, what was produced in the area. So in the account, it says that there was 60 people farming, although Bruce will talk a bit later about the other forms of farmers that there were. But the farms in the area were considered to be relatively small, and what they grew was very basic crops, grain crops like oats and barley and wheat and rye, as well as potatoes. The soil would have been quite sandy, being right by the shore, and considering the sandbanks, and so things like potatoes probably would have grown well there. And he does mention potatoes. as well as peas, these sorts of things, basic crops. And then from the sea, it's being a seaside parish, there's a lot of fishing. In the little town of Inver, it's mentioned in the account that there's 4 boats and 24 men fishing and fully providing that town with fish, fish such as haddock and cod and flounder. And then of course, shellfish as well are harvested, and such as cockles and mussels, which are sometimes found on the banks above the sandbars there. And the Reverend actually mentions that in the year of the account, it had been a less than prosperous year before, or perhaps a harsh winter, and there was a bit of a scarcity of food. But the mussels that year were very productive, and he said that the surrounding area did quite well with those mussels that were harvested. As far as meat and dairy, it doesn't say there's much in the area, and most of it's imported. And that's kind of common. I think that the foods that they would have been eating were not, there was probably not a lot of meat and dairy in the diet, and more of these basic grains and tubers and perhaps vegetables.
It may be that the soil, would be damaged by the hooves of these animals too. Being sort of sandy, it might have knocked around the grasses, not as you find in other places that have got, ground that doesn't work too well with sand animals, with hooven animals.
Mm.
So all these things are imported, which is quite an amazing thing. But it also tells you that there's a sort of marketing system that allows things to be brought from elsewhere and sold to people in that town. I mean, that's what we're learning about this parish, that it's a more like a sort of modern society, in that, things are coming in and being sold and bought, and people are earning cash income and so on to buy them with.
He also mentions the corn and how there is corn produced, but a lot of the corn is exported out.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he means wheat by that, or what we would call, corn cobs.
Yeah, I wasn't quite certain on that part, but certainly an example of how they might be exporting some of these things as well.
Yeah, so trading, Scott, this is a much more interconnected, more like a modern economy than it is than what we saw in the West Coast last month. So we're starting to already identify differences. Okay.
Maize, the corn is usually maize, and it's usually animal feed.
In Britain.
All across Europe, they don't typically eat it the way we do as a vegetable or grain.
Not sweet, like sweet corn is a different thing, I think.
No.
They in Germany and stuff, you see a lot of maize, corn, but not sweet. Now, let's talk about this other group. So Joel hinted at that we have these other group apart from the 60 farmers. So the farmers have probably got some sort of arrangement to use the land for farming, maybe a sort of lease arrangement, or what's called a tenant. That would be the typical term for someone who has an arrangement. It could be written down or it might not be. The Sassines and all that, could be in all sorts of forms, but they have the entitlement to use some part of land under this feudal system that still to some extent exists in Scotland today. Quite different to what we're used to with titles and the like. But as well as the farmers, the tenants who have the rights to farm, there are this group who are called cotters or mailers. Mailers. Why do they use the word mailers? We'll come on to that in a minute. But let's think about the word cotter, which it's the same thing, really. They're the same group. Anybody got any ideas who these people were? There are 150 of them in addition. So this is these are probably the heads of household, these people, the mailers and cotters. And so they're quite a big percentage of the total population of the parish, aren't they? If you think that they've got their dependents, as well as the 150 cotters.
Bruce, is that the same as crofter?
As crofters? Well, it's interesting you asked, Barbara. I think to a fair extent, in my experience, the word crofter wasn't so much used in these days, in the 1790s. It's a word you see in the 1890s more. So it's just, and what would they be like? What would their lives be like, Barbara? Do you think of them in that sense?
Well, they would rent from the laird, and a portion of their produce would go to the laird. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Anybody else got some thoughts about this, who these cotters might be? They're quite a big percentage of the population in this town.
Are they considered
Are
the
they
hired
travelers?
hand?
What's that, Diane?
Hired hands, like hired
Yeah.
men?
Yeah, now we're getting closer. Okay, let's just look at what we know about them, because it's very interesting, right? They're a rank below the tenants that we. Could someone check, please? Your microphones are off. It's a bit, there's some static there. Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so they're a rank below tenants, and usually what they have is a small patch of land that they're allowed to build their house on, and maybe like a little vegetable garden and a little what maybe space for one animal, something like that, like a house cow or a sheep, maybe, that sort of thing. Okay, it might have been Gail, I think. Yeah, so they have just a small patch of land that they've got their home on, and they, in exchange for having this piece of land where they can build a home, they are obliged to work for the farmer, not so much the laird, but the farmer, who would have requirements at peak times, for example, to bring in the harvest, to plant out the potatoes, to tend to animals, you know, these sorts of things, do some work around the farm, other work. So in exchange for living there, they provide some services, work to the farmer. They might as well have other activities, you know, they're not fully occupied being working for the farmer. So they might do a bit of weaving, for example, or someone in their family, the children, or the you know, older sibling or something might do some weaving, and they might participate in that, or blacksmithing, or you know, other activities, other income earning activities. Of course, these are people who are quite vulnerable to the effects of the Industrial Revolution, such as the, you know, use of production of wool for the mills in the south, as we've seen in other parts. But for now, this is their life, the cotters. And just as luck would have it, at this very time when we're talking about, the famous Robbie Burns wrote a poem about a cotter's Saturday night. So what better thing can we do but to get a bit of a feel for the cotter's life than have this poem available? And this poem you will see, you know, recited, read, delivered at all sorts of Scottish oriented functions, like, you know, Burns nights and St Andrew's Day, and, you know, various other opportunities to get together. People will read or deliver this poem that we're about to hear. Essentially, it's a bit hard because it's partly in Scots, not Gaelic, but Scots. But what it's talking about is that what the family does on a Saturday night after a hard week's labour to relax, knowing that the next day will be the Sabbath, the day of rest. And I hope that, you know, we do deal with the Scots Sabbath in one of our sessions that coming up in the next, in the future months. So let's, without further ado, listen to this poem.
Much respected friend, no mercenary bard his homage pays. With honest pride, I scorn each selfish end. My dearest meed, a friend's esteem and praise. To you I sing in simple Scottish lays, the lowly train in life's sequestered scene, the native feelings strong, the guileless ways. What Aiken in a cottage would have been, ah, though his worth unknown, far happier there, I ween. November chill blaws loud wi' angry sough. The shortening winter day is near a close. The miry beasts retreating frae the bruch. The blackmen trains across to their repose. The toil-worn codger frae his labour goes. This night his weekly moil is at an end. Collects his spades, his mattocks, and his hoes, hoping the morn in ease and rest to spend. And weary o'er the moor, his course does homeward bend.
How good is that? You know, so he's coming, he collects his spades and mattocks and his hoes, and hoping in the morning after to spend the day in rest. He goes over the moor, towards his home for Saturday night. The Cotter's Saturday night. Well, there you go. So let's talk a little bit more about this word mail, because we talked about mailers, yeah, and who are these people, mailers? And, because we've seen how they're exchanging a reciprocal arrangement, like a barter arrangement, for them to occupy their bit of land, to have their family, in exchange for providing services. So it's like bartered their services to get somewhere to live. So this word mail is meaning like rent paid in kind. That's really the sort of general gist of it. Although sometimes there might be cash involved. Generally speaking, it's more in kind, more like barter than it is some money. It's a totally feudal type thing. And so you have the phrase cow's mail, and that means the rent paid, or, the whatever it might be, the reciprocation for having a cow, one cow graze on a field. That's your sort of rent for you putting your cow out to graze in a field. Or chambermail might be the rent paid to get room and lodgings. And that also brings us to this word that we all know well, blackmail, which is an arrangement to prevent potential plunderers from attacking your crops or your cattle. A big thing in Scotland, cattle rustling. All over the place, people were always trying to find cattle they could drag off home. It shouldn't be confused with the word meal, which of course is something altogether different. Meal is a word for, a grain crop. And although it can sometimes be pronounced as mail rather than with a more way we would pronounce it today. Okay, so that's who these people are. The Cotters make up quite a big percentage of the population. There are 60 farmers, but there are 150 Cotters, so they're much more part of the community, and they're more like in the sort of group that we're trying to focus in on, aren't they? Okay. Let's talk a little bit more now about the origin of this place and its name and so on. George Douglas says that the name is perhaps of Norse origin, and maybe it's to do with this word Tain, which means something like the chief, or the place where the chief lives. That may or may not be right. In fact, the Watson, the famous book, you can get place names of Ross-shire. That's what the go-to book for that purpose. He thinks that it might not be of Norse origin. The name in the Gaelic is more interesting to us, especially us McLennans, in that the Gaelic name is this here, Bale, and this is more or less like Duik, you see, Dub, Hick, Dub, it's like black, Hick. And so that's often shortened down to this word. This Bale here means like the home or the place where they live. So Bale Duik is the Gaelic name for this place. And it might be shortened to this, Bale Duik. That's the same thing we're saying here. And interesting to us as McLennans is that this part of the name here, just chop off the Bal part and look at this word here, D-U-I-C-H. That ring a bell with anybody? Come on, you can unmute.
Loch Dewey?
Yay! Who said that? Barbara.
No, Melanie.
Melanie Loch Duick, yeah. So in fact, it's the same origin, Loch Duick, as as we have here. It's the same saint, Ducas, or however you like to pronounce it. All those names along the bottom there are variants of his name, and you might say Duick is as well. And in fact, the famous MacLennan Duick, which is what we call the cemetery for Kintail, the ancient cemetery for Kintail, that everybody should go to. All of you, I want you to go there. It's a really important place. The little picture up in the corner of every genealogy page is from that MacLennan Duick's burial ground, or kirkyard, around the ruined old church there. And it's in Gaelic that is called Kilduick. That church there and the churchyard is called Kilduick, which, kill, it's the same word as cell, in English, cell, meaning like a monastery cell, that sort of thing. And typically those kill names are all church type names. They're all places where there was once a church. There are millions of them in Scotland, not millions, but there are lots. So it's no accident then that Kilduick, what we call MacLennan Duick in Kintail, has the same name as this here. Interesting, huh? This is the MacLennan, the chapel that was built by this saint, or built to honour this saint. Really, he was said to have been born in Tain, studied to become a missionary in Ireland, and came back and died in Tain. That's the story. But this chapel was built in his honour very early on in the 1200s. A long time ago, and you can see he's still there to some extent. It was so important historically, and he was so important, the saint, that pilgrims would come from all around to this place as part of a pilgrimage. Mainly, from elsewhere in Scotland. Nobles would come to seek guidance and support for their plans. And of course, that in itself creates some commercial opportunities for the town, doesn't it? I mean, I walked a little bit of the Camino Trail in Spain a couple of years ago, and there was lots of accommodation and feeding people and services on the trail, and so on. There's a business really having a pilgrimage destination. And they also had relics of the saint there, or this is what always was claimed. If you go to Italy, you see lots of relics of all sorts of people. And here they were said to have a bell and a shirt and a bones of the saint, and that was part of the status of this location. So it gave the reason to have a town there, Tain. And not immediately, but some time after it was built, this chapel, it became a sanctuary. And it's very close to where the golf course is. Remember I pointed out where the golf club was? It's right alongside the golf club, this chapel. So it's very close to the centre of town, on the edge of town, but close to the centre. So it became a sanctuary, one of only two such sanctuaries in Ross-shire, the other one being at Applecross. So they're both really significant places before the Reformation for a long time. And in the 1000s, in 1300s, when Scotland was vying with England for independence under Robert the Bruce, the first battle, the Battle of Methven, was very unsuccessful for Robert the Bruce, and his army was virtually decimated. His wife and daughter were on the run from the English troops and came to Tain on their way to Orkney and sought the sanctuary in this chapel, but were captured by the English inside the building and dragged out, his wife Elizabeth and his daughter Marjorie, and they were taken to London and imprisoned there for 8 years until the Battle of Bannockburn, when they were freed and Scotland achieved its independence in 1314. So, yeah, I'd like to hand over to Joel to talk a little bit more about this chapel before we move on to the picture. Sorry, Joel, have I stolen some of your content there?
Oh, no, that's all good. Yeah, well, I'll just add that so that chapel was built, as Bruce said, in the 1200s to honor that Saint Duthac and to store some of the important items related to him. But then it's said that in 1427 or so, a group of Mackays were chasing an enemy of theirs, and he tried to seek sanctuary in the chapel, and then they burned it down. So they didn't honor it as a sanctuary. And as a result of that, they had this other church that was built a little bit before then, and that was called the Collegiate Church in Tain. And that was in the account which the Reverend wrote in 1783. He said it had been there for 300 or 400 years already. So in any case, they moved all the important items related to the saint to there. And then at that point, it became again even more of a pilgrimage site, and the King James IV, who was the last king of Scotland to speak Gaelic, he is said to have made a pilgrimage to the Tain Chapel every year of his life for the last 20 years. That's between 1493 and his death in 1513, and he always made those pilgrimages in the fall. He made a different pilgrimage in the spring. I can't remember where that was, but the one to Tain he was said to make in the fall. And I did some research on that, and what I found was that they had said that he made these really lively pilgrimages. Like, he had musicians with him and perhaps a jester, and so his arrival into Tain was probably quite a spectacle. And a lot of people might have come out to see him arriving, and it made me think about when Queen Elizabeth came to Vancouver. My mother was living in Vancouver at that time, and they had an expo. It was the Expo of '88, and the Queen came, and after that, after the Queen came, Vancouver's population exploded, and so I imagine that the King coming to Tain every year was very prosperous for the town and helped them economically, and I think they probably would have enjoyed him arriving.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Joel. I just skipped over this slide back here. This is the picture of Elizabeth, the Queen, Robert the Bruce's Queen, and his daughter, Marjorie. And this is the English inside the chapel, capturing the Queen and the Princess. Just to go back to what Joel was talking about, the pilgrimage that was made by James IV, the local people heard that he was coming barefoot. So they built a road from down here in the next parish down, Logie Easter, up to Tain, and that's this road here. And if you look carefully on this map, in fact, somebody said to me yesterday that the contemporary maps still have this written on them. So this is a map from the mid-1800s that I've got here. You can see it's already got the railway and not the A9, of course, but the railway and but not the bridge. But the down here you've got, it says in there, King's Causeway. Can you see that? And down here there's a King's Bridge as well. And this is where the Rosses live down here. And so they've built this thing. It looks like, if you see pictures of it, it looks like a Roman road. You know, it's got big boulders that are all put together so that the king can proceed along this King's Causeway. Still there on the maps that you buy today of or your Google Maps, still there. How good is that? Yeah, along the causeway. Okay, so now we're moving on to the church. So after the capture of the Queen and the release later, and the support given by the Ross family, the Earl of Ross, William, built a church at the instruction of the kings at the time to make Tain a significant place in its own right in the 1300s. It's not a terribly large building, 21 meters by 7 meters is not very big. In sometime later, 150 something years later, it became a collegiate church, meaning that it was like a place of learning as well as some normal functions. And this building stayed being the church until 1814. It was called the parish church, it's where the town went to church. So if you're talking about people living there in the 1790s, this is where they went to church, in this building that, was built way back in the 1300s. And at that time it was replaced with a bigger church and went into decline. The roof collapsed and it was in great decay in the 1870s when it was restored. A new roof was put on and so on. So that's the church where people who are living in this parish would have attended in this time we're talking about. Okay, let's talk now about this term, a royal borough. You might think that says Burgh there, mightn't you? Like a German mountain. But it's actually just the same word as the English word borough, that's spelt with O-U-G-H. How do you say borough? Any advances on borough? Borough? Do you know it? Is it a term that's used at counties, really, aren't they, in the US? And Canada too, for that matter. So that's what it means, like the county. That's really like what the North American county is. So the Royal Borough is a separate legal entity established under a different charter to the parish. It's a different thing. So they say the Royal Borough exists within the parish of Tain. The Royal Borough of Tain exists within the parish of Tain. And the original documents go back quite a long way to the 1400s. But it was reconfirmed by James VI, who you might know as James I of England, same fella, who was king at this point. And he confirmed that the borough of Tain was erected and constituted from ancient time with all and each of the liberties, privileges, courts, markets, and other immunities appertaining to our free royal boroughs. So you can see here the hints about what this means, this term, by talking about liberties and privileges and courts and markets. These are the things that come only by being a royal borough, particularly your own courts and your own markets, those sorts of things, and not to mention the ability to collect taxes or levies or charges of various sorts. And of course the whole idea is, in feudal terms, that the money that's collected a bit of it gets siphoned off and sent to the king, who's given you these privileges here mentioned. So it's not this is not a British thing, it's not a Scottish thing, it's a European thing, really. It comes, remember that the Norse had settled in Normandy in France 100 odd years earlier than the 1066. And also, of course, all around Britain before that, in the north, Northumberland and so on. But after they were established, the Normans had invaded the south of England. They were invited by King David I, who ruled in these years you see here, the 1100s. That's less than a century after 1066. He invited these Normans mainly to become lairds in Scotland and allocate all these names that are Fraser and various other names of French Normandy origins, and they were brought in. They brought these ideas of these market towns with them. The idea being that all over Europe, you see them the same. Walls were allowed to be built by the king is giving the privilege to these people to establish a location where they have walls and gates to prevent people coming in and out, and also to be able to trade and to hold markets and to collect taxes. So that's the sort of idea there. Yeah, putting money into the royal coffers. So in 1630, this toll house here, a toll house was built here on this location in Tain. This is the Tain toll house that we're looking at. And its function is to collect tolls and taxes and charges for people to attend markets and so on. But also in these buildings is the courts of the borough, the magistrates' courts, and there's also a jail there. I'm spelling it that British way. In fact, on the notes, I spell it the other way. There's a jail in there. So a bell was made in Belgium for this to adorn this earlier version of the toll house. But during Cromwell's short time, they came and stationed themselves here in Tain, took over, and trashed the place. So it had to be rebuilt. So in 1706, they started rebuilding it, and it didn't finish till 1733. And the bell that had been originally installed in this original building is still there today, the bell from 1630. That's a long time ago, isn't it? So the marking, so you usually have a toll house. I saw a wonderful one in a place called Włocławek. Another one in Poznan in Poland, they have this same sort of idea. In the middle of the market, you have this toll house, and they'll do things like checking weights and measures there, as well as collecting taxes. And usually in Scotland, you have this thing called the mercat or market cross in the middle of the town square where the markets are to be held. So the point of these crosses, mercat crosses, you can Google them and see lots of pictures of mercat crosses, but this is the Tain cross. It's, been squashed into the corner here now, but in normal situation, it would be in the middle of a marketplace, a square. And it indicates the right to hold a market given by the charters that established the borough, and also the place where the market is to be held. So it's marking the marketplace. So the origin of this word is quite interesting. It is a word that came from the French. You see now why that is, because I talked about the Normans coming, the Norman lairds, aristocrats. And this is the French word. I guess it's pronounced burgis or something to that effect, meaning a market town, which in itself is derived from the Latin word burgus, which means a fortress or a wall. So you were seeing the sort of origins of this word that we're using for this place. And it reminds me of this word burgess. Now, I know that mainly from the House Assembly or the House Legislature of Virginia. The House of the legislature in Virginia is called, which of course is the benchmark for states' constitutions and whatnot in all over the US. And it's called the House of Burgesses that Thomas Jefferson was a member of, and Thomas Jefferson's father was a Burgess in the House of Burgesses, and so on. And it was with him that George Washington negotiated various things. So this House of Burgesses has the same root as the words that we're using here for this borough in Scotland. It came to mean more than just the person who sat in the assembly like we see in Virginia, and became more like a elected official as well, but also unelected, like a senior person in the official side, the administration side of a municipality, or you might call it county. There were 66 of these by 1818, and there were about 70 odd in 100 years earlier. So, that's the sort of numbers we're talking about throughout Scotland. For example, different towns would typically have markets on different days. So you know, some of the place names include the word borough. So Roxburgh, yeah, or even Edinburgh, right, have the same root in them that comes the same word as House of Burgesses in Virginia. And different towns, like, you know, you might have in Glasgow, a market, for example, on a Saturday was a normal thing. And then, on a Thursday. And then in Arbroath, there'd be a market on the Saturday, and a bit like, you know, traveling markets are today. People move around different times, but they know that it's going to be on each week at a certain day, and the people selling things at the markets move from one to the other. Some of them, but others, of course, are more fixed. You know, let's say a baker might be more permanent in the town. So when it's a big day when the market comes to town each week. And then they'll have separate days during the year that are like super events, big days in the town. There's probably more performances and activities happening. And those so-called major market days are in Tain, were each year on the 26th of June, the 4th of August, 30th of December, 6th of March, and the 20th of November. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these big market days in the town. And of course, they functioned a bit like Facebook does today, as being a place for people to turn up and gossip and exchange information about what's selling and what's not selling, and who's doing what to who, and what regulations are changing, and, you know, the Facebook of the time. You know, in this country, we're having a great standoff with Facebook. Only last week, they prevented me from posting a link to the Clan MacLennan site in a Facebook post. Facebook did, because they're having a standoff with our government about being told to do what they're trying to prevent fake news getting out, really. That's the thing, by having fact-check news more readily paid for by Facebook. And it looks like only today that's they've backed off. Facebook have backed off, and are now going to pay news outlets to provide fact-check news in this country. World first. You know, they thought we'd never do it. Google 2 weeks ago threatened to remove search in Australia. Google threatened to remove search. You don't do that to any government, do you, and expect to get away with it? You know, that's that's just showing how arrogant they are. And the same with, you know, Zuckerberg did the same with Facebook, but now they've had a lot of one-on-one discussions between our senior politicians and Zuckerberg himself, and they've agreed to pay money now for fact-check news. That's a first. Like, you know, in this country, we, of course, were the first to bring in seatbelts in cars, and the car maker said, "You'll ruin our business. You can't do that to us. What a terrible thing it is." And, you know, now the world just assumes we have seatbelts in cars. We were the first with that. And then, of course, we came in with just plain packaging cigarettes in this country. And they said, the tobacco companies, "Oh, you'll ruin our business. We won't be able to differentiate our cigarettes from other people's cigarettes, and plain packaging, it's going to wreck us." And they brought all sorts of legal actions all over the world. And now, of course, it's common worldwide that we have plain packaged cigarettes that we introduced here in this country that they said would never work. So fact-check news might be appearing more on Google and Facebook. That wouldn't be a bad thing, I suspect. Anyway, I divert. So these boroughs had, you know, soon after the old statistical accounts were written, there was calls for making the boroughs a bit more accountable, meaning a bit more democratic, because a bit like the House of Burgesses, you know, the sons took over from the fathers, and they elected each other. And this was becoming a problem in 1818, and there was a parliamentary inquiry into boroughs throughout Britain to make them more democratic, you know, more not self-appointed and corrupt, really, is what they were. Heritors. Is this your one, Joel? No. No, I'll carry on. Now, the heritors, this is talking now about the landowners and what their responsibilities and so on were. They were, of course, a significant group, and there were far more here in this parish than we've seen in other parishes. 15 is quite a large number. Most of them were absentees. One of them was from that place. The largest one was Mr. MacDonald from that part I showed you on the map earlier, Cadpole, which is just out to the east of Tain, but that's where he came from. That's probably all you need to know about that. The rent was 650 odd pounds. Oh no, I should talk about their responsibilities. Of course, these people are not just collecting rents for their land. They have responsibilities too, which is to pay the minister, the schoolmaster, perhaps sometimes some other teachers, and maintain roads and bridges. These sorts of activities. They probably held, became like adjudicators in issues too at this time. Adjudicators. Although some of those rights have been taken away post Culloden. Okay. Now, another really important thing about this parish is that because it's the capital of Ross-shire, it's no accident then that the clan Ross is totally enmeshed with the life in Tain, Ross, and we should talk about the Rosses. And even today, if you go to the Museum of Tain, even the website, they've got all this stuff about Rosses, this and Rosses that. When's the next gathering for the Ross clan here in Tain? And people go back there thinking this is their home base. So it's not called Ross-shire for nothing, because these Ross people were the kingpins. And the name that their progenitor was this fellow here who's got, this word, it's the same as the word in Scotland, they would say Farquhar. I think here we would say Farquhar, that name. There's another surname, Farquharson. That's a name that we probably all know. But this is the first of those people that became the Rosses. I asked somebody who spoke Gaelic yesterday to pronounce that, but I'm not going to attempt to reproduce it for you, I'm sorry to say. But it means, this word here means priest. So this means the son of the priest. Something like McFarlane or something like that. Anyway, I won't try. So son of the priest, it's an allusion, a reference to the priests at the famous centre in Applecross, AX, it's the abbreviation we use for Applecross. So, and it's sort of like claiming a bit of credibility that they've got proper, respectable roots. I think that's probably the way to put it. But really what happened was that they, the king from the south of Scotland was trying to impose his will on the northerners, meaning the people in today's Ross-shire and Moray. And this fellow here that we're talking about, Farquhar, he miraculously came to the rescue with a large group, a large body of men of his own clan and his allies, appearing on the scene, and soon wiped out opposition to the king's authority, because the king was losing these battles to, this is in the 1200s, middle of the 1200s, was losing, and these people came to his rescue. So they, as a result, got to be earls of this part of the world because they had saved the day for the king. And then the son William took over about 1250, about the middle 1200s. And his claim to fame, William, the son, was that he succeeded in suppressing or removing the, what you might call Vikings or Norsemen from the Outer Hebrides. So that was a big claim to fame. So that's why you have Ross-shire going out there to Lewis, Ross-shire includes Lewis. It's all obvious now, isn't it? Once you know this is the background to this story, and quite an interesting aspect, really. These people in the north didn't want to be suppressed by the kings from the south. In the battles between Robert the Bruce and the English, they supported Robert the Bruce, you'll be pleased to hear. But when it came time, for our point of view, to have the battles of Glen Shield, in other words, the Jacobite risings, they supported the other side, you might call them, the Hanoverians, the kings from Hanover, and were quite active in repressing the people they called the Mackenzies, being the opposition. That's how they think of them, as the Mackenzies. And, of course, our clan is very closely associated with Mackenzies. There, Olness is, you know, up there, we saw where that was in one of these earlier sessions, and there was quite a standoff and a battle there as part of this broader campaign here for the Culloden, that culminated in Culloden, the second Jacobite rising. Their seat, that's their pile, you might call it, or their castle, the big castle, is down at the bottom end of that King's Causeway I showed you. It's a place that's called Balnagown, and there's a river with that name as well. That's their crest. Success nourishes hope, the Rosses. Okay. Now let's talk about the church building, which we've already talked about a bit, but he's asked, the minister, of course, is asked not just to talk about economic things like the crops and the land and the nature of the economy, the markets and things that are sold and bought, prices and so on, but also to talk about a few church matters. One of them is the state of the church building. And of course, as you would know from our earlier discussion, he's talking about the building being 400 years old when he's preaching in this building. And he says the mason work is entire and firm. Isn't that good? And here it is still today, even many years later, 600 years or more. He says a new roof was put on 40 years ago, earlier, and he says there's a little statue of St. Duthac in the west gable of the church. And then he talks about the chapel being there, and he acknowledges that the King James IV was a regular pilgrim to the chapel, but it was burnt down by the Mackays, who Joel has told you about. Now, let's look at the man himself. This is a picture out of the scan of the content of the old statistical account. It's, sorry, the FASTI. You know, I talked about, when we did the demo Olness, I talked about this FASTI. It's just a Latin word for like a list, really, like a list. But the English version of that name is the succession of the ministers since the Reformation. And so this is the entry about George Douglas in the Tain part of it. It says he was born in 1740, a son of Robert of Kilturn, and we know that's where Balcony Castle is. He went first to Kirkwall, that's in the Orkneys, Kirkwall, great place, I'd recommend going there. And he was presented by George III. All you Americans know about George III, don't you? The tyrant that everybody was rebelling against with the 13 colonies. The madman, you might say, but that's him, George III, presented this George Douglas to be the minister of Tain. That's how it worked. That was the system. He had to be sponsored by somebody, and this fellow was sponsored by George III, the villain of the 13 colonies. You know, the statue being pulled down, that's him, the famous picture. He married in 1779 to the daughter of the neighbouring minister of the parish next door, Editon, just up the Firth on the lower side there, right next door, who's a relation of my wife's, has a lovely monument there to him, a whole wall, big wall to Joseph, minister of Editon, and they had all these children here. And you see in the FASTI that they list, like it's really like a social gossip column partly. They list that this fellow, his son, Joseph, named after his grandfather, obviously, became a barrister in London, born in 1790 and died in 1849. And here it talks about the publications of George Douglas. The only publication they mention is that he wrote the statistical account for Sinclair's Statistics. This thing we're looking at, right? So he wasn't big in publishing, but he died, as I said, quite soon after, really, like 11 years after he wrote this statistical account in the saddle. The family history that Joel found of his family here described him this way. It said he was distinguished for personal piety, fervour in prayer, and evangelical sentiments, which he delivered in a chaste and beautiful style. There you go. That's him, George Douglas. So we know a bit more about him and his family and his personality. And, you know, he would have known all these people who lived there in this parish at that time. Okay, over to you, Joel.
Okay. Yeah, the Mickle Ferry disaster. So we showed earlier on where the ferry had gone, kind of between where there's two spits that come out into the Firth, and kind of right along where the bridge is now. So this ferry saved people from having to go around about to the end of the Firth and then all the way around from Dornoch all the way to Tain. So in 1809, this was in August, people were going to a market in Tain. It was the Lammas market, which is a market that they have. It's kind of a festival midway between the summer solstice and the fall equinox. And so there was all these people going to this market, and it's said that when the ferry was leaving from Dornoch, the ferry was overloaded, and it probably would have been more overloaded had the sheriff of Dornoch, Mr. McCulloch, not raised some concerns to the overloading of the ferry, and perhaps the sailors or the captain of the ferry may have been a bit drunk. In any case, the ferry left somewhat overloaded, and partway across the Firth, it flipped over and sank, and nearly everybody died. Well, 99 out of the 120 or so people on it died, including the sheriff of Dornoch. So it was quite a tragedy if you think, well, that's 100 people dying, and of course the population in those areas wasn't super large. So I imagine that disaster would have continued on in people's memories for a long time. And even now, as you see, there's a plaque there commemorating or remembering what happened. There was a fund raised for the survivors after the ferry had sunk, and it said that they raised almost £3,000 for the survivors and the families of the survivors of the sinking of the ferry. A lot of that may have come from the soldiers abroad that we talked about earlier. But yeah, certainly an important thing that happened in that area in that sort of time frame.
Yeah. You want to do this one too?
Sure, yeah. Well, when I was doing this, reading through the statistical account, they had all these different names for all these things, like a farthing and a penny. Well, we know penny, but a shilling and a merk and a pound and a guinea. And I couldn't work it out because they listed the cost of one thing in a merk and the next thing in a pound and the next one in a guinea. So I had to make a spreadsheet to figure out what all these things were. But yeah, basically, yeah, this is the coinage of the time. So a farthing is a fourth of a penny, and 12 pennies are in a shilling, and a merk is strangely 13 shillings and 4 pennies, which works out to be 2/3 of a pound, which a pound is 20 shillings, and then they have 21 shillings, which is a guinea. It's very complicated, but it's interesting when I was reading it about the guinea that sometimes prices were listed in guineas rather than pounds, because of course then it would appear to be cheaper. Those schemes of advertising continue to this day. So yeah, and that's a coin from around that time. I'm not sure who is the face on the back. Do you know the face there, Bruce?
Well, it has the number 8 there beside it, doesn't it? Maybe that's related.
Oh, does it? I don't.
Someone.
Oh yeah, yeah, the 8th. Yeah.
I don't know who.
Yeah.
Generally, he says that the prices of things have increased significantly over the last decades. That meat and various other things have gone up in price. Meat, butter, cheese, fish stocks, he says, are in decline, and therefore the prices are going up. And butcher meat has gone up. You know, all these sort of things he's talking about. So you can go back and read that in the statistical account if that interests you. In fact, it might be relevant, you know, to compare different prices across the different parishes that we're dealing with, but that's not.
Yeah, it mentioned things like the price of a rooster or a duck being, I think it said 3 or 4 pennies for a rooster or a hen. Yeah.
3 to 6.
3 to 6, yeah. Yeah, it was kind of interesting seeing the prices.
Yeah. So it's a source if you need to go back to that for anything, or you might want to put it in your, account of different places if you're writing a history of your people who live there. Not necessarily at this place, but it gives you an idea of another aspect to think about their lives. And of course, the real thing is we're seeing here much more commercial type, what we would call normal activity of, people using money to buy things and things that aren't grown in their part of the world being brought in and sold, and them growing things and sending things out, getting money in, so it's a more what we would think of as normal situation, having the market town there so close to where they live. Okay, character of the people is a heading in the old statistical account, so we should talk about that. And one aspect that it comes out of what I just said, and that is that because you've got the market town there, you've got a much larger number of tradespeople. And by that, I don't mean electricians and plumbers. I mean more like weavers and bootmakers and wheelwrights and what else? Ploughmen, maybe. These sorts of activities that, can really be focused around a town market type atmosphere where you've got exchanges of money and people making a living in a way more closely associated with our own lives than we saw in Loch Carron, where people were much more self-sufficient. So you've got the 80 tradesmen in the town and 20 more in the countryside. And then he talks about how there are numbers of people dealing in ales and spirits. 6 dealers had licenses to do that. And there was also one who had a wine license, presumably not grown locally. But generally, apart from having, despite the fact of having 6 dealers in ale and spirits and 1 in wine, he says the people are sober. That's what he describes them as. He says people contributed liberally to supporting poor people during the recent thing that Joel referred to, the recent poor harvest, and they brought in grain from the Baltic to keep people, support their poor people from the difficult times. Yeah. And that was distributed not just to the poor, but also to farmers, cotters and tradesmen as well. So, let's look at the poor then, and that, since we've got into that subject, this is not necessarily the workhouse in Tain, but it's a picture of people in difficult circumstances. So he says that there were 130 names, that is out of 2,000 odd people, who were listed as poor. That's a big percentage, I think. It's over 5% of the people are listed as being poor. And it could be from old age or some other problem. And they collectively receive £20 for their support during each year. A small croft house building is provided for them to use, not like this one here, but a small croft rented out for to a low price for the use of the poor. He comments a bit unusually, you see down here, that in most parishes there's a thing called a mort cloth. That's the word there, and it's a cloth that's put over the coffin when it's being, displayed and delivered to the burial ground, and it's because people don't have their own mort cloths. They typically, in most parishes, rent it from the parish church, and the income from the mort cloth rental goes towards support for the poor. But he makes the point, Reverend Douglas, that in this parish, the money he makes it rather heavily, I think, lays it on with a trowel, the point that the mort cloth money is not going to the poor. It's going into the general coffers for the town council and the magistrates. Maybe he's implying that it could be a source of funds as it is elsewhere when he says that. That's a little interesting aspect. Just in some places, the records of the rental for the mort cloths survives and can be used as a way of finding out who died, you know, because you'll see who the burial was for and the date of the burial took place. So you got effectively a death record in that place. I've never seen one between you and me, but that's what I've heard said. Yeah. So that's the state of the poor. Joel, back to you.
Yeah, the language of the area. So in the Tain parish, both Gaelic and English are spoken. In the country, it's mentioned that some of the older folk don't speak English; they speak only Gaelic. But what we see is English is becoming more popular in the town, and it's in schools. The English is taught, and by the time of the new statistical account, which is about 60 or so years later, it's mentioned that Tain has twice as many people who use English as their main language than Gaelic. Although in the country, more people are still speaking Gaelic. But what we see is that the Gaelic language is starting to be more reserved for the countryside, and the stronghold, of course, then becomes the Western Highlands and Islands. So there's a bit of a slow decline of Gaelic, but both languages are preached in the church, and the Reverend would have spoken Gaelic. And there's the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic you see there. I can't quite do that one yet, but
yeah, that's an interesting point, really, that, you know, in effect, what you're seeing is because you've got a trading town like Tain, that they're, as you see today, you know, in say, Holland or whatever, you know, people speak English as their trading language, don't they? You know, even in Germany, you know, you see that's the Bayer and these companies have English as their corporate language, because that's the language that they're doing their trade in with people from all around the world. And that's the same sort of thing here. This is a market town. They've got things coming and going, people, they need a language to trade in, and obviously they're trading outside their own district, and so they're using English to do that trading with other parts. Nothing changes really, does it? Looking at the schools, this is not necessarily a picture of Tain School. In Tain, there was a school headed by Mr. George Mackenzie. You see the Mackenzie starting to, you know, feel their way into these places. There's all sorts of significant roles, and one of them is the teacher. You know, typically they complained that their salary was low and they didn't have any pals where they lived, but this is not probably such a big deal here. The languages that the subjects he taught were English, Latin, no Greek, writing, arithmetic, and bookkeeping and geography. Pretty good coverage. He had on the roll about 52 pupils. Now we know that we've seen other times that typically students didn't always turn up to school every day of the week and every day of the year, because they might have had work, you know, seasonal work on their farms or their properties or places where they lived, they needed help with. And so 52, it's a bit of a notional figure, you know, attendance isn't as required as we see today. He receives 300 merks. Now, you know what that is from Joel's very clear explanation of what a merk is, 2/3 of a pound. You remember the numbers, Joel? Anyway.
It was
yeah,
two-thirds of a pound.
That's all we need to know.
Yeah.
And also another man teaches English and writing to poorer folk, a Sunday evening course, and he's from this thing that's called the propagation of Christian knowledge. Remember we saw those elsewhere too. It's an Edinburgh-based group that were promoting, really, it's like a disguised, trying to make good Hanoverians out of everybody by bringing them across the ways of the English-speaking world. And typically they had like more trade-oriented rather than learning any Latin or bookkeeping. Yeah, so the teacher at the school, for the Christian school, receives a house, a garden, and sufficient grass for one cow. No cow, just the grass that the cow might need. You like that, Joel, don't you? Like, just enough grass for a cow, no cow. He has to provide his own cow, apparently.
Yeah, bring it with you.
Okay. So let's look at the McLennans who live in this parish, and we can see, looking at the, you can all go and get this pie chart of all the parishes at different decades. This is the pie chart for the decade from 1800, that is up to the end of 1809. And you can see there that this is the second of 4 pages of parishes listed, and this one is there, the dark blue colour. When you put your mouse on the dark blue colour, that highlights the dark blue one over here. And you can see that in this decade there, we've recorded 11 births of McLennans in this parish, and by comparison with all the other parishes, this is only 1% or so of the births around, the biggest one being Gairloch. Fodderty is the next, Applecross after that, and Conton. These are the big ones where you find McLennans in this time. This is a bit of a rough, what would be the word, rough and ready exercise, because we get these numbers from baptismal records, firstly. And if it says that someone was baptized in Tain, good. That means we can be pretty confident they came from there at this time. There were, of course, no government listed records of births, just the church baptism records. And the other thing we get is if in censuses much later, that is 1851 onwards, they are asked to say which parish they came from. So if they say they came from Tain, we will put them down as being born in Tain about whatever the calculation of the year is from the 1851 census. But if they died between 1795 and 1851, then of course they won't get into this list as being born if their parents didn't get them baptized, which is possible, probably even quite likely. There were quite a few, and they won't be in here. Or the book that it was recorded in might be lost too. That's another possibility. So, this is really a bit of a rough and ready exercise, but it gives us a bit of a, with those limitations, it gives us a bit of an idea of how significant this was to McLennan births. So about 1%. And this number Joel is quoting here relates to this number 11 that's in here by being, this is just for the 1 decade, and he's talking here about these 2 decades. That's a fair comment. But yeah, you can go and get these easily just by looking in that dark left-hand side menu on the main genealogy page and look for clan stats. It's about a third of the way down the list. And let's look at a particular McLennan who lived there. She's called Anne, and her ID number in the clan records is 1269, I for individual, 1269. And she was born in 1802. Her father, Donald, was a shoemaker in Tain. So this sort of makes more sense now after what we talked about today, doesn't it? That, you're in a market town. It's quite a good thing to be a bootmaker or a shoemaker. Because people might come there looking for shoes that they couldn't get in their own rather more agrarian parish. And you got so it's the sort of activities that are possible through having a market town. She married in 1823 a Charles Rattray. And if I click to the next page, you'll see that this is a bit hard to see, but her husband and herself farmed on the Chapel Road. Hey, how good is that? We know what the Chapel Road is now, don't we? Because of our earlier thing. And the Chapel Road, we know, goes down to the golf club, past the chapel, right next door to the golf club. So they're really close to the centre of town here, and they're living on the Chapel Road, and they've got a farm there. They were there for at least several decades, and if you look, it's a little bit small, of course, but if you look at her page in our clan records, you see here that in 1861, remember she married in the 1820s, she's 57. They live on the Chapel Road. There it is, says Chapel Road, with her husband and her family and 1 servant they've got, although it says here 2 labourers and 1 boy. But that's because they're employed to come into the farm and not living in the household. So the one person who's living in the household is this John Mackay here, or Mackay you might say, He's called a cow herd. So they must have had some cows to be herded. You know, cow herd is like a sheep herd, and a cow herd looks after the cows. There's a shepherd looking after sheep before the days of wire fencing. And here's Anne herself here, the wife, born in Tain, you see, born in Tain. And there are their children, all born in Tain. They're called farmer's son or farmer's daughter. And they are the years they're born. Some of them still there. We've got others down here that are not still in the household in 1861. Still alive though, like Catherine, she's not there. Oh yes, she is. Donald. And then by the next census, you can see here just that it's called Tain Borough, where they are, not Tain as it is up here. And they're still in the Chapel Road. She's 10 years older. In fact, it's 9, isn't it? With her children and one servant. And you can see here that the head of the household is Donald. Donald, who up here was 26, is now 35 in the 10 years later. And the husband she's a widow. There you go. So they live there on the Chapel Road, just, you know, between the town and the chapel, or just after, probably in maybe even where the golf course is today. How about that? And she died in 1875. So we'll have a good record for her. That's 1875 because it's after the compulsory registration in 1855. And we know she died in Tain. And if you look down the bottom here, you'll see that it's got a copy of her death record. And she's buried, look at this. She's buried in the St. Duthus Old Chapel Kirkyard. There's a headstone there. So it all makes more sense now, doesn't it? Now that we've been through this evolution of the town and what it is. Okay, the curiosity, we're getting towards the end now, I'm sorry to say. Not actually in the parish of Tain, but near the parish of Tain, out on the west, the east of the peninsula there, on the actual side facing the ocean itself, not the Firth. We've got this stone, which is this. Remember, we saw this place on the map, Cadboll. It's a district, and Hilton is a locality within the district of Cadboll, to the east of Tain. And this stone is of Pictish origin. It's from 800 AD, a bloody long time ago. And on one side, not the other side to this, the seaward facing side, it has a Christian cross. It's the time when the Picts are being converted to Christianity. And they put this Pictish cross there, and beside it there was a chapel. On this side, the reverse, it has a more secular story to tell of this woman who's riding with a large brooch, wearing a large brooch, riding side saddle, and going hunting, where these people are all her companions. Hunting, it's a hunting scene. And these other symbols are Pictish in origin. When the other side of this stone has been chipped away, someone got it in the 1700s and thought that'd be a nice headstone for themselves. They started cleaning off the crap that was on the stone that had been there for how long? 900 years, and thought they'd engrave their own name on there for their headstone. That'd be a good use for it, they thought. Not a good idea. Anyway, then they apparently found it too heavy or something to move, so it didn't get used as the headstone after all. And in recent times, quite recent times, you know, in the last decade or two, they've gone and found these chippings from where they chipped off the pits, and they're recreating it like a puzzle. But the stone itself was removed to a part a bit further south initially, near Evanton, but then it was taken to the British Museum in London. Oh, what do the Scots think about that? They think that's a good idea, nicking their stuff? Don't think so. Big to do about it. Big fuss was made, and eventually it was returned to Scotland and is now in pride of place as one of the best examples of a Pictish stone that they have in the Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. And this is a picture from the Tain Through Time Museum, which is a voluntary museum there in Tain, only open some days of the week. Yeah. Now I want you to look carefully at this little bit down here. This is part of the curiosity thing. You see that pattern down there? I want you to look at that carefully. And you remember I pointed out that a place called Morangi was on the coast there, just near Tain. Well, that's where this brewery, this distillery, is located. And I was told yesterday, we would say in this country, we would say Glenmorangie. That's how we would pronounce it. I don't know how you pronounce it, but I was told by Scots, several of them, that the pronunciation there is Glenmorangie. Morangie, yeah, that's the bit that gets emphasized. In fact, on that earlier map, it had a double R there, so maybe that's a clue. But look what's down here. They consciously took this, borrowed it from the stone we just looked at. So when you're next to drinking a Glenmorangie, or however you like to pronounce it, you look at the label and you'll think, I know something about that pattern they've got down there. It's from the stone that's out to the east of Tain. There you go. That's a curiosity. Okay, so let's review the objectives of today's session, because we're getting to the end of our time. In fact, we've overrun a bit because it did start a bit late. So the purpose of today's meeting was to understand everyday life in the parish of Tain in the 1790s. To do that, we looked at where it was located, some of its history as the Royal Burgh, as well as of the parish, because that's quite important to everyday life in this parish, the Royal Burgh, and we dwelt on that to some extent. We looked at the structure of life, and in particular, we focused in on those cotters and how they fitted into the rest of society. And we looked at the people themselves, their character and their poor and so on, and how they went about earning income. And we looked at Anne McLennan and others who lived in the parish of Tain and were born there as a way of digging in to see how we would do for finding out about individuals. Now that's the session for today.